All right. Hi, everyone, and welcome back. I am Brett Norton, once again with Beyond Clean. Real quick, before we get started with the next session, I'd like to highlight the features on your screen. There's a resources window with sponsor resources. Getinga has provided some really good links to their website, so please go ahead and check those out. We have a Q&A window, so jump on in there, ask questions throughout the conference session and at the end of the session, or the speakers can choose to answer the question throughout, or at the very end, we'll allot some time for Q&A and try to get those questions answered. But we certainly do encourage questions, so please feel free to dump those in there. Speaker bio and contact information is also there on your right side of the screen. And I'd also like to highlight a new icon. There's a smiley face icon, so you can share your reactions to the information presented throughout today's conference session by selecting your favorite emoji. So it's always a good way to interact if you want to use that icon. Our speakers for this next session are Jill Holdsworth. Jill is a manager of infection prevention at Emory Healthcare. Jill is a dedicated infection prevention leader and advocate. She is the AAMI Protective Barriers Committee co-chair, and she serves on the APIC National Board of Directors. Always good to have Jill back with us. Katie Belski is the Quality and Patient Safety Coordinator at Ascension. In her role, Katie has the opportunity to further grow in the quality and patient safety arena. This provides her with a strong platform to advocate for the sterile processing profession. Their presentation title today is Out of Cite, Optimizing Your Department into Accreditation Awesomeness. Are you ready to step into the world of accreditation excellence? Then, of course, you've come to the right session. Jill and Katie are diving into the crucial role of quality standards, compliance, and infection prevention in sterile processing. These infection prevention experts will outline key auditing tools and practices to help you identify process gaps and forge strategies for continuous improvement in your sterile processing department. Please join me in welcoming Jill and Katie to the virtual stage.
Good morning. Good morning, everybody. I'm a little bit embarrassed. I don't know how to blur my background, and now everybody can see how messy my desk is, but that's okay. We're really excited to be here. I'm Jill Holdsworth, and I'm really excited to be paired up today with Katie Belski, my friend and colleague. And Brett did a great job introducing us, so we don't really need to go into any further introductions for ourselves. But Katie and I are friends, and we're kind of excited to be presenting together for the first time. So this is going to be really fun for us as well. So we hope that you guys have some fun too. Our goals here this morning are to really go through just a huge amount of stuff that hopefully will help you guys get through preparing for your next survey, going through your next survey. Of course, I'm going to be focused a lot on infection prevention things. Katie's going to go through a lot of quality things. So all of the things that you need to work on when you're focusing on that continual readiness, which of course is what we all want to do. Though in reality, of course, when we know we're getting closer to that survey time, we're all really running around trying to hurry up and be as compliant as we can be, right? But really what we want to be is continually ready, because we know that these standards are truly for keeping our patients safe all the time, which is the overall goal. So what we want to do today are some of these main objectives. We want to look at what are some of the key areas for regulatory and survey readiness, and what are some of those areas that are commonly cited. And we want you to be able to take away some of the action, some of the very practical things that you can go back today and start implementing and looking at. What are you maybe not looking at that you can look at today, tomorrow, tomorrow since it's Saturday, but what can you just easily start having a better eye for as you walk around? Before I was an IP, I never looked at ceiling tiles like I do now. So, or hopefully you know what an escutcheon plate is, but do you look at your escutcheon plates now around your fire, the sprinkler heads in your department. So just those kinds of things when you're walking around, make sure you're looking up. Always look up, because the surveyors always look up. And those are the things that they'll get you on. So just make sure that you're taking notes. You're making yourself a checklist of the things that you're going to be looking for, and just really doing kind of mini audits every day while you're walking around your departments. We're going to talk about what to expect when you're expecting. And no, we're not having babies, but we're having surveys. So we're going to talk about that today. And then again, talk about common areas that you may see cited, or not just cited, but what are the surveyors looking for? It seems like it's survey dependent, but they're getting more savvy in sterile processing, high level disinfection, sterilization. So they are coming in more prepared. I think we've all had surveyors that don't really know what they're talking about, but some surveyors, they're very savvy in sterile processing. So, and they're getting a lot more savvy because it's so important. And so they're getting more training in this area. So we really want to make sure that we're prepared when they come, and that when they come in, we know how to answer their questions. Our technicians know how to answer their questions, and they are impressed when they walk away from our departments. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Hopefully you take away some nuggets of wisdom today, and that you go back feeling a lot more confident for your next survey. So Katie's going to get us started and talk about what you can expect when you're expecting.
So similar to what Jill had just said about our objectives, the quality objectives will be quite similar. So I'm going to help our team demonstrate effective department environment preparedness for survey activity. So that includes partnering with your infection preventionists for rounding, and even your quality and patient safety coordinators if you're likely enough to have them in your facility. Also demonstrate effective documentation, education, and training preparedness for your survey activity. So that will include things like making sure that your competencies are up to date, and all training documentation for your new employees are also up to date. And then department team members can respond appropriately to surveyor questions. So often when surveyors appear on site, everybody will get a little scared. Sometimes you'll have a few team members hide. So what we want to do is help everybody feel confident that when a surveyor is on site, they approach them and ask them, how can I help you? And feel confident walking alongside a surveyor and answering those questions. And usually that also helps the surveyor leave your department quicker if they identify that your team members are knowledgeable and confident in what they're doing. So we'll go to the next slide.
I love that comment about the surveyors might leave quicker. I think that's what we all want, no matter where they are. It's like a sigh of relief when the surveyors leave. It's like, whew, okay, they're gone, but they can always come back. So don't think that you're kind of in the clear once they leave, because they can always come back, and they can look at anything. And I always caution people when you have your lab surveys or your stroke surveys, and that's why we need to be continually ready, because a surveyor, whether it's Joint Commission, DNV, CMS, anyone can look at anything, no matter what they're there for. So that's why we need to make sure that we're doing audits like these, rounding, looking at this stuff all the time, because you never know when someone's going to show up. We've had OSHA show up by surprise. CMS comes all the time. So making sure that we are doing team rounding, which is what I'm going to talk about here, is so important, because everybody has a different eye for what they're looking for, and learning from each other is so important. So talking about infection prevention and quality rounding together, this is one of the things that I find really interesting when all of us round together. And I always suggest that when you round together, you invite facilities and EVS to come with you. Because if you've ever done this before, a lot of the things that you end up finding, especially in the environment, have to do with EVS and facilities. And you save so much time, you learn from them if you just have them there with you. And partnering together improves that relationship. And the reason I say this too is it sometimes will save time, because a lot of times we don't have time to sit there and put in work orders, right? And when I will say, well, this is a work order, this is a work order, that hole in the wall, that hole in the floor, the stained ceiling tile, all of these are different work orders. And I always suggest to people too, do not put in one giant work order for all of the 15 things we just found, because what ends up happening is they'll close out the whole work order because they fixed the one hole in the wall, and then the other 14 things disappear. So having that person with you is so important, because they will see all of that with you and hopefully help you take care of it on a regular basis. We've had chemicals that leak and damage the wall. We've had leaky sinks. All of those types of things make it a lot easier when you're rounding together. Involving the team members in the process of rounding, I find to be empowering and to be really helpful, because who better knows the things that are broken, not working well, than the people actually doing the work? How important is that? So involving the team members when you're doing these types of rounds is, I think, the most important thing that you can do. So when we round, we're going around and we're talking with the team members. We're having them show us the processes. And I will admit, when we first started doing this, people did kind of run the other way and acted like we were the surveyors, and they didn't want to talk to us. They were suddenly too busy. But after a while, they started coming to us and saying, we're so glad you're here. Can you come look at this outlet that's falling off the wall, or this sink that won't stop leaking? They started coming to us. And it takes a while to develop those relationships and to show them that this rounding is something that is helpful. And you have to build that process, but it is so helpful. So I so encourage you to involve the frontline team members, and not just the day shift. We have to make sure that we're rounding at different times with different people, including management, including your educators, including people that work on the clean side and the dirty side. So it's just so important. We want people to be able to ask questions. We want to involve frontline team members in the PI projects. We've even come up with things like how far do we have to walk to the time clock? And that's even too far. We've come up with so many different things just from this rounding that has been so engaging for our frontline team members through the years. And it's been really, really great. Having a debrief at the end of the rounds, I mentioned this because as I've talked with infection prevention groups and with sterile processing groups, I have had people tell me, we don't do a debrief, so I have no idea what was actually found during the rounds. And this is really important for all parties involved. So if there's a group of people rounding and then everybody just leaves and nobody knows what you actually found, how do you have follow-up actions? How do you know that things are going to be taken care of? You don't. So that's why it's important. Have a debrief, or come together and say, okay, we found these 10 things. Make sure somebody's assigned those 10 things, and then come back and make sure they were actually taken care of. Sometimes the SPD leaders are left in the dark and they don't even know what was found. And I've heard many times that IPs come in, they do their rounds and they leave and they don't even share what they found. And that's unacceptable. And that's why making sure that everybody comes together and does this as a team, that's why it's so imperative. So that's where we need to work towards. And next slide.
I just wanted to add one thing too about the work orders. It's also good to have them separate in case there is an unexpected survey and one of those issues is identified. You can pull that work order and it could help eliminate or reduce a possible citation also.
And I always keep track of work orders too. I sometimes had a theory that my work orders were getting ignored because they were never done. So I always track them now. And so I will put them in and then go back in, and depending on what system you have, you can track them by number, by name, by location. So if you do put in a work order, I would just make sure that you're tracking to make sure that it's done, and making sure I always suggest that if you're putting it in, don't call it in, making sure that you have record that it's put in, because that's happened before where you call it in and then it kind of like goes into never land and you have no idea if it was actually tracked, if there's a work order number. So always have documentation that you put things in, because what if a surveyor comes in the next day and they say, why do you have this hole in the wall? And you can say, well, there is a work order in, we do have a plan to fix it. They may actually give you some grace with that, because you have a plan to fix it. There is a work order and you have documentation for that. If you say, well, I did put in a phone call, and they'll say, do you have record of that? What's the work order number? And you'll say, I have no idea, but I swear I did it. That's not gonna cut it. Okay, so talking about reviewing your processes. Things have changed over the last few years with surveys that I've gone through. I've gone through DMV surveys and Joint Commission surveys and CMS and OSHA, and it doesn't matter who's surveying you. They don't want the manager, director, the educator. They don't want the leadership to speak to the processes. They want the team members not just to speak to the processes, but they want them to show you. Walk me through the processes is what they're going to say. They're going to just name some random processes and say, okay, why don't you show me how you do that? So it's not enough that we can regurgitate some of this information anymore, but we need to actually show how we drain the water, refill it, we calibrate if we have a failure of the automatic dosing machine, or how do we know when the temperature is in range? How do we know how to do all of these things? We need to speak it, and then we need to show that we're actually doing it correctly. So make sure that your team members are doing mock surveys and prepared for these types of things, because they don't want the director telling them, or the educator. Of course, the educator knows the answer, but how are we going to prepare our team members for these types of things? Next slide. So now I'm going to kind of go through some of the things that I have seen most brought up, most cited, and kind of some ways to prepare. So this is something that I love to include in the things that I talk about, because this is something that I was asked during a survey that caught me off guard years ago. Was they came and they asked for a list of all of my scopes that I had in my entire building, and because they wanted to go see how these scopes were handled, were high level disinfected, and they wanted a list of all of them. So now I tell everybody, just go ahead and have that list ready. Have a list of every single scope that you have in your building, and use that to go ahead and audit yourself. If you have that list already, then you're ahead of the game. And you can use that whenever you want to. You can say, hey, I'm going to go to this place today that has scopes, or this place, and use it as your own tracers. And then think about not just scopes. What other items do you know that you use high level disinfection on that isn't a scope? Because the last thing you want is for a surveyor to find it and you don't have it on your list, and then they say, well, why didn't you have this on your list? So go ahead and have that list ready, and that way that you kind of know what's going on everywhere that you have any of this going on. And especially if you have something that you're having to manually soak, anything that's not automatic HLD, because that's where you really need to focus. If you can't get rid of it, focus some attention there, because that, if the surveyor sees that, they're really going to focus on that process. If you can partner with your IP to do regular audits, especially of your scope processing, then that's really great. That's what we do here, and it's going really well. And if you don't have an audit sheet already, what I suggest to people, it's not brain surgery to go through and create your own tracer. What we do is we take the IFU of the scope, and we just create a tracer from the IFU of the scope, and just boom, 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 all of the different steps that you're supposed to be taking. We just create a tracer audit from that. So a lot of people ask me, how do I start an audit? How do I start a gap analysis or a tracer? Sometimes it's as simple as just take the IFU for a product or a process, or you can make your own. Don't think it's super overwhelming to start your own audit process. We can do it very easily on our own, or start from the back end and start with rounding, see what you see, and make those into your questions, and kind of go from there. It can be very easy. An interdisciplinary work group has been something that I know a lot of facilities have found very helpful, where you can call it like the high-level disinfection sterilization work group. And you can go through some of these workflows, IFUs that are very difficult, what protocols need worked on. So some of these things can be really helpful for that work group, and then report up to the infection prevention committee, or just report within yourself. You can go through IUSS cases here, or just really things that are troubling you. What we do here at my facility, we don't have that group, but on a weekly basis, I huddle with the SPD leadership, and we go over things that that we're having trouble with, or that they need help with, or if they're having scopes that are coming down after many hours instead of 1 hour, or if we're having any trouble with vendors. So things like that we work on together on a weekly basis. So if you're not doing that, I highly recommend it. We're finding it very helpful to meet on a weekly basis. Quality monitoring, something that we have found that many hospitals are struggling with is surveyors will ask you, what quality monitoring are you doing? So one, are you doing any? And you should be doing something. And that's what they're going to want to hear is, what are you doing? Then they're going to ask you to show them what you're doing. And are the logs up to date? Or where are your records? They're going to want you to show them your records. So you can't just say, oh yeah, we do quality monitoring. They're going to want you to say, and here's the data that we're keeping. And then they're going to want everybody in the area to be able to speak to it. So say that you're doing protein testing and endoscopy. They're going to want everybody that does this process, or that does reprocessing in endoscopy, to be able to speak to it, to the process. They're going to want to have everybody be able to show them the records and in that area. So be sure, again, that not only the leadership can speak to it, that every single person that does the process can speak to it, to speak to the actual process, timing, any kind of QCing that has to happen, any kind of logs. Everybody needs to be able to speak to it, because that will get you cited quickly, because it'll be the one person that doesn't do it that often that comes in and gives the wrong answer, and then you'll get cited. That's always what happens. Next slide. I have used this picture for so many years because you want, it's kind of like, what all is wrong here. So you can just take your pick, but you want people to be able to speak to the proper flow of your sinks. If you have a 3-sink system, if you have a 2-sink system, whatever you have, you want to be able to show what you're doing. You want to be able to speak to it. And this is probably one of the worst pictures that you can show, but make sure that everybody can. I love the emojis that keep popping up on the screen. They're making me happy. But you want everybody to be able to speak to what they should be doing and what shouldn't be happening. So this is where the regular rounding is helpful. And I know people get busy, and so then they take shortcuts, but please make sure that that it's standard work. Does everybody know what their standard work should be? So please just keep rounding as leadership. If you're in IP or quality, set up those regular roundings so that you can keep rounding on things like this. Next slide. And this is that same brush. And my son would kill me if he knew that I used him as an example, but this looks like his toothbrush. He chews on it when he brushes his teeth. And that's what it looks like. So if any of your brushes ever look like this, to where you're literally chewing on it like a chew toy, obviously it should not be here, right? So this is something very, very easy for surveyors to use as something that can be cited. This is not hard to see. So you want surveyors to have to look really, really hard to cite you on something, right? So you just need to, and on the left here, you need to make sure that things like this are not present. You shouldn't have a rusted brush. You shouldn't have a chewed up brush. So what's your brush policy? And as an example too, we went and we asked team members what the brush policy is, and the team members gave a different answer than what the leadership gave. So again, we need to make sure that everybody is giving the same answer, because the leadership was telling us, well, we just did an in-service on this, but the team members were showing us a different process. So this is a great example of where we need to make sure that the frontline team members are doing what the policy is. And sometimes that can be very different. And that's where we need to tighten up, where we do our practice audits and practice like mock surveys that we can help our team members with. So, but brushes, temperature, sink flow, those are really, really easy. And these are all from pictures are from when I was a very new IP. And I used to tell people, if I could find these as a new IP, I guarantee you a surveyor can find these things to cite. Next slide. This one is I always think is a little bit harder for a surveyor to find, but if they walk into a soiled room and they see all these filters that are still in the lids of their containers, then they're probably going to start asking some questions, right? And so we have a certain area that rolls their C-section tray or puts their C-section trays into a case cart, and we have to constantly check to see if these filters are out. So in my opinion, though I wasn't in every C-section, if they are still located like that top picture in the top right, then they probably were not checked and to see if there were any holes, right? Probably. So what I don't want is to give a surveyor any reason to ask additional questions, right? So we want to have a good process where the filters are removed, they're held up to the light, they're looked at for any defects, so there are no questions, because that's what's the safest thing to do. Next slide. And this is one of my favorite pictures. This was, again, when I was a very new IP, and this is the thing that I used to complain about the most, this top picture. This was the temperature probe that we were using, and it was never in the water. And I used to tell them, if I can walk by and tell that you're not keeping the temperature because it's not even in the water, a surveyor will absolutely be able to tell this, guys. So I was told that they would like be watching for me to come down the hall, and they would like, put the probe in the water, hurry, she's coming. And that's not helpful either, right? Because we aren't even we definitely aren't keeping temperature and doing what's best for the patient if we're only sticking the probe in the water when the IP comes down the hall, right? So automated temperature, obviously better, but then you also have to be able to speak to, how do you know when it's correct? How do you know when you need to, what's your process for draining the sink, putting more water, what's the temperature range? So you still have to know some information. And you really need to also make sure you know how to calibrate if it goes down, and you know how to do a manual dosing of the enzymes. They will ask that, and that's always a tricky question. So making sure that your team knows how to do that is really important. Okay, next slide. And this is always one of my favorites, and I have a great story. We all know what this is, but I want to tell you a story. Surveyors know to look for this. This is an easy one, right? They know to look for open instruments. They know what closed instruments look like. We had a survey a few years ago, and I knew that they were going to go into this one room, and I even went right ahead of them just to be sure that everything was sprayed, opened, everything looked great. And I swear it must have been like right after I left, somebody stuck a tray in there and things were closed. And then the surveyor went in right after that and saw the closed instruments after we made sure it all looked perfect. So it just speaks to, we have to make sure we have good processes all the time. So because we don't want to have to be lacking confidence right before the surveyor comes in and making sure that they don't see that we didn't have sprayed instruments or that we didn't have open instruments. We want to make sure that we just know that it's going to work out well, because it's like that all the time. But this one is always so hard because it's like one person forgets, or it doesn't happen once. So this one is an important one to keep educating on and keep going on, because this one is hard. And if you have areas that are more than just the OR, and I spoke on this at HSPA this year, you have to continuously preach this to cardiology services, EP labs, cath labs, IR, women's services, the ICUs. You have to make sure that all of those areas that don't necessarily get this type of education all the time, you have to make sure you're continuously going to those places and teaching them as well, auditing their instruments and their sets as well, because they are not hearing this as often as the OR, and they're not dealing with it as often as the OR. So make sure that someone is doing tracers there, whether it's IP, whether it's SP, whether it's the two of you together. So make sure that you are paying attention to those areas too and giving them attention. Next slide. I'm going to throw it back to Katie, and she's going to introduce us to EOC rounding.
So EOC rounding, environment of care rounding, usually you typically see it done partnered with an infection preventionist and usually the SPD leader. But I think it's important that if this isn't implemented in your department, to make sure you connect with a leader or the infection preventionist to get this scheduled on a monthly or routine basis. And it's also good to include your quality team members if you have any at your facility. And then here you can look for things like developing that rounding tool in your department. And I have an example of tape being where tape should not be. So it's nice with your department's set of eyes to kind of look around, but sometimes somebody from the outside coming into your department will identify those issues more readily than somebody who walks through the department every day and might get used to load stickers on loading racks or load stickers that fell off of a instrument tray, maybe on some shelving. So those would all need to be removed. And also this comes in handy to have it documented too. So if surveys were to round and identify any of those issues, you could present that information to the surveyor and say, yes, we've identified this, it's being addressed. And even better, if there is an action plan that's been put in place, to present that to them on how you're going to correct the identified issues. And there's also, Joint Commission has on their website a tracer with AMP tool, which your facility can access and customize to how they would like. So you could make one for EOC rounding or for case cart auditing, for instrument tray auditing, instrument transport. That would be something you'd need to work with your quality team and leadership on getting set up and implemented. And I'm going to go to the next slide here for Jill.
And just to tag on to one thing Katie mentioned, for those of you that use DNV, they love to see action plans and risk assessments. So if you do, and Joint Commission as well, but DNV really likes that. So if they come and usually when DNV is coming, but when they come and that you're not going to have fully finished working on something that is non-compliant, make sure you have that risk assessment or gap analysis ready to show them and your action plan, and they will really like to see that, and usually they will accept that, and sometimes they will not give you a cite for whatever is going on if you have well documented action plans and risk assessments based on whatever it was that you found. So Joint Commission is sometimes accepting of that. Sometimes they'll still give you the citation, but document that you had that in place. But regardless, risk assessments and action plans are still a good thing to have in place and to keep you organized on what you need to be working on. So looking at sterile storage, this is something that kind of drives me crazy. I know that you guys probably get driven crazy with vendor storage in general. I get crazy about how vendors will come in sometimes and just take stuff out of sterile storage themselves and pile things on top of each other and just take things on their own. So make sure that you know what is your policy on vendors coming in and taking things on their own. We have had to tighten up that at some points because of stacking things on top of each other. Cardboard boxes, we're going to talk about a little bit more in a minute, but understanding where cardboard boxes are okay and where they're not, but cardboard boxes in general can carry mites and bugs, and you don't want them anywhere near sterile storage. You need to make sure that sterile supplies are stored correctly, and I have some pictures I'm going to show you in a minute. But one thing that my sterile processing manager and I have done together is go to the areas outside of the OR and really looked at how they're storing their sterile supplies. And we unfortunately find all the time pill packs that are torn, ripped, stained, have holes in them, and that have to go back to sterile processing just because they're stored so poorly, and they're just kind of like thrown in bins and whatnot. So go ahead and go to the next slide. I have some pictures of just some of those things. So on this rack on the left, things are just kind of like thrown on top of each other, just crammed in the same racks. And when you start kind of going through some of these things, especially when peel packs have things on top of them, you'll find that they're going to get torn, of course. So really working with some of these areas on how they're storing things and how to keep them safe. This picture on the right, we have found in some areas, especially outside of the ORs, these like toolbox type storing spaces. They look like toolboxes from your garage, and they just throw a whole bunch of stuff in there. And when you and then they never get clean. And so once you like try to clean it out, you just find all this debris and dust and dirt in the bottom of these drawers. And so this is a good example of why you shouldn't do that type of storage, because it's never getting cleaned out, and it's just shoved in there. Everything's shoved in there. You're going to get holes, you're going to get rips, and almost everything else that was in here had to be taken out and re-sterilized, because there were a ton of peel packs in this drawer before I took this photo. Next slide. Oh, and that middle photo was the before picture. So this is just kind of some examples. This left-hand photo, this is a clean storage area with just tons of boxes. I think we've all seen this before. Or if you have a materials area that's combined with your sterile storage for your soft goods, for case carts, you have to really control the boxes that come in there for your case carts, because the boxes, again, can carry a lot of mites. You should never have outside shipping boxes that come anywhere near your sterile storage. And you can tell what those outside shipping boxes are because they will have the label that has the address for your facility on it. And really no cardboard box is safe, but that outside shipping container is the worst. And this middle picture here, you can see that when you have these drawers that you pull out and everything's just shoved in there, you can guess that most of that is probably damaged in some way and had to be sent back. So you can see the Joint Commission EP4 down there, the IC standard EP4, and that this is about storing medical equipment, devices, and supplies. And so this is why you really need to partner with some of your colleagues across the facilities to really look at places other than just the OR. And that is why I preach this so much, because there are places all over your facility or wherever you work that have sterile storage. And sometimes they have sterile supplies and they're not being stored in a manner that meets sterile storage guidelines. They're not being stored in a safe manner. And that's where those of us that understand sterile storage really need to help these areas. Next slide. And I love this picture. I've used it for so long. Katie and I were kind of laughing at it earlier this week. Like, this is a really good example of why you need compliant transport containers, and we don't need to be using these Tupperware. We don't need to be using tape. As you can see over here on the left, this is what happens when you use stickers, when you use tape, and we cannot use these. There's probably so much bacteria stuck to that adhesive on these, and you can't yet. I mean, the sticker that says biohazard is absolutely correct, because this is gross, and we cannot use these types of containers. And we did a huge project a few years ago at my facility where we made sure every department, especially outside of the OR, had compliant per the AMI guidelines transport containers. They were red biohazard bins. They locked. They were puncture proof, with a lid. All of the guidelines were met. We got rid of everything that looked like this We do not allow tape on things, so we got rid of any kind of tape, any kind of stickers like this, and made sure everybody had what they needed. And we're actually just starting to go back through that again and making sure that everybody has what they need again, because with any container or any item, some things get lost. So we're actually starting to go back through and starting with the ICUs to make sure that all of those containers still exist, that they have their spray for instruments, that they remember what to do with it, which is probably the biggest need right now. And that if a surveyor came through, that they could speak to what to do with the spray, the transport container, and how to get to sterile processing, which is probably the bigger issue. So we'll probably be doing some walking tours as well from all of these areas to make sure that they remember how to get there. Next slide. Hand hygiene, of course, is one of my loves, but also fingernails is one of my biggest soapboxes. And I have had a survey before where I have gone and stood at the door of sterile processing, and every single technician and person working in sterile processing had to come by me and show me their fingernails because the surveyor was getting ready to come by. And we had to give people some long lunch breaks that day because they did not have compliant fingernails. So please make sure that in your departments, you do not have people that are wearing any kind of artificial fingernails. This is not safe and is not a best practice for anywhere in surgical services. And we need to make sure that we're not only maintaining no artificial products on our nails, but a safe length of our real natural nails, and they should be kept clean and short. But hand hygiene practices in SPD, if you don't have a hand hygiene policy, then make sure that you do, and make sure that people are following it. And especially when they're coming in and out of doors, make sure that you have the products available. Sometimes we don't set ourselves up for success, and make sure that the products are available where we need them to be. Next slide. And this is a great example of why we don't use tape again. So this is a cart where tape has obviously been put over and over and over. And now we've just got this adhesive mess where bacteria is just growing and just sticking to everything. So if you need to hang a sign, then use something else. If you need to attach some, I don't even know what all was on here, why all this tape ended up being on here, but you have so many different options if you need to hang something or attach something, and tape does not need to be it, because we're just transferring bacteria from one thing to the next. So we need to just get rid of the tape. Next slide.
And I wanted to add to that too, with when you're looking at case carts like this, there's some that are flat on the top that have those black caps kind of where that shaft comes up there, and they can often fall off and need to be replaced. So if those black caps are missing, when you send them through the cart washer, water will pool in that entire shaft. So you want to make sure that those are replaced or taken out of use prior to survey activity.
And these are just some other kind of tidbits about the environment that you can make sure that you're compliant on an everyday basis. And the picture I have over here, this is the one that drives me crazy because it's so easy. But when your eye wash station caps are just hanging there, that just kind of grosses me out, because if you actually need to use your eye wash station and it's got dust or whatever else is collecting on those caps, and you actually need to flush your eyes with it, the first thing that goes into your eyes is whatever collected on those caps. So the one thing that you need to do is just keep them covered. That's part of being compliant with those the eye wash stations, and make sure that someone is flushing it, making sure that the temperature is correct, because you also don't want to scald your eyes if you need to be flushing your eyes. So please make sure that that is that very simple thing is being done, and that your eye wash station is never blocked. I've been in a facility before where we did get cited because you could not get to the eye wash station because a cart was in front of it. So, and that's not just on survey day. Make sure that's every day that the eye wash station is able to be accessed, because you need to make sure that your staff is able to get to the things that they need to keep them safe. And if you have an emergency shower, then you need to make sure it actually works. I did work in a place where it wasn't hooked up to water, but nobody wanted to ever test it because it was the emergency shower and it would make a big mess. And so once we figured out that that it wasn't hooked up to water, I made the facilities guy be the one that got under it to test it, because they were the ones that didn't hook it up to water. So make sure that's tested as well per your protocols. And please make sure you do have a separate hand washing sink for hand washing. You cannot wash your hands in the same sink that you're doing your cleaning in. And I've seen people that even have hand washing soap at their decon sinks, and that will have a lot of questions that follow if a surveyor sees hand soap at your decon sink. So I wouldn't even have it there. Okay, next slide. And environmental cleaning, this is a huge one, and we're going through a big project with this right now, where we've been working really closely with EVS, and we're using QR codes for accountability and clean and dirty to make sure that the AAMI Amendment 1 in the ST79 is followed. And this is just so important to make sure that you are getting the department cleaned, that you're working with IP, EVS, and SPD together, and that you're following that new standard in the AAMI ST79 guidelines. So if you haven't done this yet, I really encourage you to work together as a team to do this. There are some things that facilities have to do in that Amendment 1 as well. So I would really encourage you to slowly go through that with all the parties involved, so that you get your department cleaned appropriately per the standards. And surveyors are asking about this. They are asking about all of the 4 new amendments and asking you what your plan is. Are you following them? If not, how are you going to? What's your plan to make sure that you're doing all of those? So if you don't know what I'm talking about, then you need to go look at ST79 and the 4 new amendments. If you do know what I'm talking about, but now you're freaking out because you don't have a plan for getting compliant with them, then we need to make sure that you're getting there. And happy to talk through how we're doing this. But we all need to make sure that we have an answer for those 4 amendments, because they are asking them. And like I said, they're getting savvier. They know what's new or newer. And so you need to be able to answer that as well.
And I'll just add, when you have the plan, make sure you document the plan, because then from a quality standpoint, we could provide that to surveyors and potentially prevent or reduce a citation.
Yeah. And I just quickly wanted to show, and hopefully you guys go over this, but whatever disinfectant you're using, we do talk about contact time, and this is a great surveyor question. So whatever disinfectant wipe you're using in your department, know what the definition of contact time is. This is a great one for them to ask you, what is it, and can you demonstrate it? So, and I've seen them do that before, but this is a good one too for if you don't remember, then you can always look on the container, and it's always on the container. Just know where to find it in case you forget. And I've had people get really nervous, and instead of saying 3 minutes, they say 3 years because they get nervous. But just always remember, like, well, I'm going to use my resources and look on the front of the tub here. And that's totally fine. Joint Commission wants you to use your resources, double check if you have to, but go back to your departments, look on the front of your tub of wipes or container, and know where to find that information. Always use your resources. Never guess. Always say, I'm going to double check. I'll be right back, or I'll look. And this happened to us in a survey recently where one of the nurses started to stumble, and the other nurse actually kind of held it up. I wish I had one to hold up, but she was like holding it up like this right beside him, and he looked and she was pointing to it. He was like, oh, it's 3 minutes. So it's totally fine to do that. So just make sure you know where it is before the survey time comes.
All right, and I'm going to talk a little more in depth about documentation. So you'll want to make sure all staff, including any travelers, permanent, new staff, and even surgery staff that might come down to your department and help assemble trays or work in decontam, any areas that they're functioning in, you'll want to make sure they also have a completed competency. And again, like Jill had mentioned earlier, it depends on the surveyor. Some are very savvy on documentation, and others, have a stronger focus in other areas. But if you get a surveyor that's more knowledgeable on documentation and really focuses in there. They could potentially ask if you have team members from other departments that float down and help, and they could request to see their competencies. You also want to make sure you have record of any education that you give to the team. And this is also helpful if you have certified techs. They can refer back to this and enter this in for their continuing education credits. And often surveyors will ask about equipment preventative maintenance and if you have documentation of this. And they'll also ask team members if your facility has reverse osmosis, or they might say RO. I found that some team members aren't familiar with that jargon, so make sure to do those quizzing questions with your team members to make sure that they're comfortable answering those questions. And then they'll also ask if you do use RO, which mechanisms are they hooked up to? Is it hooked up to your sink water? Is it hooked up to just your instrument washers? And then you'll want to confirm regularly that your sterilization and testing documents are being completed. So this might look like having your team leads do it on shift change and doing a shift report off that way. I found helpful in the past where I would do a paper shift report for the team to look at, and then I would also document it and send it via email to the whole team. So everybody knows they received it. There can't be anybody that said, I didn't receive that communication, because it's all in their email. And then if you're in a leadership position, you can also refer back to that if a surveyor were to ask if that education was received. And then also, if you're a policy owner, it's important to make sure that you frequently check your policies, that they're not expired, and that you're referring back to the ST79 and making sure that everything in your policy is aligned with the ST79 guidelines, and that your staff are familiar with how to access policies. And then another suggestion too would be to support what Jill was mentioning earlier about the shelves that had damaged instrumentation and wraps and peel packs. You could implement cleaning assignments for your staff that are documented, and also use that to refer to when surveyors are rounding, and just as like preventative measures. Sometimes it can, again, help the surveyor leave your department more quickly because they'll see that you have all of your ducks nicely in a row. And again, you'll just want to quiz all your team members, make sure they know how to respond correctly to a surveyor if they're not sure on a question they're asking. It's always better to say, let me find out for you, or I don't know, than for a team member to guess or give information that might be incorrect. It gets harder to dig out of that hole than if they just say, I don't know, let me find that out for you. We can always provide that information to a surveyor at a later time. And doing daily questions such as race and pass, what they stand for, all those things, the more you quiz your team members on them, the more comfortable they'll be answering those questions, where it'll feel second nature then when a surveyor is present. And you'll also want to make sure that your team members are comfortable referencing IFUs, whatever that looks like for your facility, whether it's one source or if you're keeping things documented in another way. They'll want to be able to readily show a surveyor how to find that information. And then, as Jill said earlier, make sure they know how to walk a surveyor through the process. I've seen it happen where surveyors will ask, what detergent are you using, and what is the ratio? And in the moment, team members, even with the bottle right in front of them, get nervous and mispronounce the detergent they're using. So really quizzing your team members to make sure they're comfortable answering that, so that when they are a little nervous, it's easier to do. And then at this point, we'll take any questions.
Thank you guys
All right.
so much.
Yeah, thanks, Jill and Katie. A lot of really good information, and we've gotten a number of requests for your slides. So I think that it's probably something that people are going to latch onto and share with their departments. So thanks for all the visuals. I mean, I've been in some departments where I've been really impressed, and then others where I see stuff like what you showed, Jill, at the sink with some of the brushes and things laying all over the place. It can be little bit scary at times, but also, a real good point to, show people how to improve. And when we're talking about workflows, right, this is what we're looking at as far as this conference is concerned. If you are, cleaning up and making sure that you're following these processes in terms of looking ahead with a Joint Commission survey, your workflows are obviously going to be better as well. Jill, I wanted to point this at you as far as vendors playing a role in these surveys, because when I was on the vendor side, I often went to hospitals and I worked with infection preventionists to round with departments, as you both mentioned, and helped explain and actually demonstrate the pre-treatment process. So can you elaborate a little bit on the role that vendors play in helping departments with surveyors coming through?
Yeah, no, that's a really great point. And I think there's a lot of different ways vendors can assist, because there are different roles even within the manufacturers and the vendors. So I think that the best thing that we can do is to ask the vendors, how can they help us? Because I think sometimes we don't know. And some vendors have clinical educators, so they're obviously going to be able to help us in a different way than maybe the salesperson can help us. So like to your point, if there's somebody with a pretreatment spray, then obviously in services, watching the process. I always welcome a second set of eyes on processes to come back and tell me, well, hey, you know what, I noticed that everybody wasn't always doing this part of the process, and you might want to take a look at that. Anytime somebody wants to come in and do kind of like a full beginning to end type of tracer event type of, I don't know if they call it a tracer, but everybody calls it something different. That is super helpful, because then you get kind of like a whole book of things you need to work on. Sometimes even like your instrument repair services will come in and do some audits on specific processes. So I think the best thing that you can do is to email the vendors that you currently work with and say, hey, in terms of survey readiness, what do you think that you can help us most with? Because there are so many things that they can do. I think in-services are the number one, but really that second eyes looking at the processes, and a lot of people offer their own audits, which I find extremely helpful in things like this, because they can take so long, especially those tracers I was mentioning with the scopes. We have tapped into those resources a lot with asking our vendors to do scope tracers for us, because you can't just watch one scope reprocessing event and say you're done and you know everything you need to work on. So sometimes that can be really helpful, because they have the time to invest in you to look at those things for you.
Right. Yeah, that's a great answer. I think the other part of that too is vendors are well-rounded. They're going to a number of different facilities, so they sometimes have that intel. I would often get the bead on what surveyors were really focusing on at that point in time, because they tend to, not all of them, but some do tend to focus on specific line items, and they will target it as soon as they come into the facility. So it's always good to have those, like you said, extra set of eyes and the extra intel to help people prepare. Katie, do you have anything to add to that?
Nothing to add. I think Jill explained things well.
All right. One of the things too, I think, is the concept of rounding, instilling that in the departments and having the leadership work directly with infection prevention. And I think that is a really good tool in terms of utilizing for all teams when talking about the OR and sterile processing, because it's a big topic today, and making sure that we're working together as a team, right? So is it important to involve, Katie, I'll direct this at you, to involve the OR in the rounding process and having the OR come in and see what sterile processing is doing, and vice versa?
Yeah, I would agree. It's very important. Even if the OR leaders are busy, even just having a representative from the OR that can help be the voice of the OR and also be eyes and ears that can bring the information that they're finding in SPD back to the OR. So there's a better partnership and understanding from both departments. Because to truly be successful, you need that full circle effort from both OR and SPD.
Yeah, great answer. Jill, anything to add to that?
Yeah, just to add a kind of a different take on that, one thing that I feel is really important is to also involve our surgeons. And one thing that I've had a couple of our surgeons do is really to take their own sets and to open them up and inspect them and to really show them like how much work goes into reprocessing each of those, to show them what the indicator means, to actually show them, the surgeons and the residents, and show them how to inspect a blue wrap and what it means to have a hole in it. So I think it's important for all team members in the OR, not just the nurses and the techs, but even the surgeons and residents, and show them how much work goes into what they're using, so that the next time that they complain that something's not ready or that they want it to you want them to hurry, that they understand what they're actually asking for.
Right. Yeah. And it's, this is a ever evolving discussion, and hoping that we can someday get there where it's a full, a running squad, a running team with the surgeons, the OR techs, and everybody working together. It's really, really important, and something that I do know that a number of hospitals employ, but it's just something we need to continue to emphasize. Jill and Katie, we are at time, and I just wanted to thank you both for joining us. Jill, it's always good to see you. Katie, good to see you as well. Really great presentation, a lot of good information. And those of you out there that have asked for their slides, I'm sure they're more than willing to share those with you. So you can see Jill and Katie's contact information on the slide in front of you. We've also got their information in the screen that you're seeing on the right-hand side. So please feel free to reach out to them if you have any other questions or concerns related to any type of accreditation surveys. Please feel free to reach out to them. Jill and Katie, thank you both.
Thank you.
Always enjoy it. Appreciate you. All right, we've got a 10-minute break. Well, about an 8-minute break till the next session. So thanks for joining us. Go grab some coffee or whatever. And Lindsay is going to jump in and co-host with me. So look forward to that. Hank's also going to be hosting this next discussion. So stay tuned. We'll see everybody in a few minutes. Okay.